tell you the story. The story that lies behind this castle of nightmares and dreams. Well, once, thousands of years ago perhaps, after the great people had left their cities, there was a fort still here. And a king, King Helm, turned that fort into his great castle. And here he ruled the lands of the west, all the way to the far roaring ocean. But it was not enough, for anarchy had spread beyond his domain. And so it was, in the stone circle that lies in these castle walls, he swore a holy oath, that by the powers of the old gods, and in the name of the new, he would ride out there and then and conquer all the lands the great folks had left, north, east and west, and bring them under his rulership, that they may know peace and happiness quite again. And so he rode out, going first to the west, and going first from the west to the east, and he conquered then the lands in the east with war. But before mid-summer, he gave them peace. And then he swore an oath to his new people that he would not stop there, that he would conquer all the broad land, that he would make it all his. And once again he swore, but this time on the holiest of all stone circles in those lands thereabouts. He swore by the olden powers that he would not cease. And then he rode west, and he conquered all the lands to the west, all the lands of mountain and of lake, so that the south and the west and the east he ruled. And as the year was waning, he turned at last north. But there was a broad land before him, for after thinning, the land seemed to widen once again, and he knew there were fiercer tribes than any he had met to come. And it was late in the year by now, after Hallows Eve, when finally he thought to himself, I think I ought to go back to my capital to spend the winter, and perhaps to minister to my new lands. I can carry on conquering another time. No, we'll just insert a pause. And so it was. He turned round and went back towards home. Now, when he was in the marshes near his home castle, but a day away or so, he camped. And he grew tired of his men and their endless folly and gambling, and he crept out into the forest that lay in the midst of those marshes, and there he drank a bottle of wine. And he thought of his home castle, and of how good it would be to be home. But in the midst of his reverie, suddenly, great hairy hands were put over his mouth, and his head was held still, and he could not struggle. But he saw coming towards him, riding on a badger, a great figure, broader than a man, if less tall, with a long black beard. And the creature got off the wild badger on which it was riding, and said, "Well met, King Helm. Here is a king you cannot conquer. I am a Narian. And now you and your men are mine." And Helm was shown. His men still slept and gambled, but all around them there was a host of these dwarfs. And the Narian said, "So I'll give you a choice. I could kill you if you like, or in this land a wild fancy has taken me. Let us swear here to be blood brothers, you and I, one to the other, brothers in arms and fate." And Helm said, "I have no choice. I'd agree to anything." And snorting, Anarion took his hand and cut it, and put it, the blood that flowed out, into a horn. And then he gave it to Helm, and Helm took out his own little dagger, and cut his hand and pressed his blood into the horn. And then Anarion mixed the blood with wine, and they drank a toast to each other, there in the wild forest, amongst the twisting oaks. And then Anarion turned and said, I have a wild fancy as we drink together. You are a good companion and a true. Why not make more of this? I'll tell you what I do. When you get married, which will be soon, I will come to your wedding and make it such a feast that whatever sorrows follow, your people will remember it in joy. And when I get married, you can come to my wedding if you like. And Helm said, So I swear! And the next morning, Helm awoke, and he was alone in the forest, and there was no sign of the dwarfs, and he wondered if it was just a dream. Well, he came home the next day, and there was his great castle, and there were new people to meet, and new kings who came and paid him homage. Amongst them there was a princess of the western lands, the lands of mountains and of rocks, and her eyes were blue and her hair was black, and he looked at her with love. Well, one thing led to another, and they got on incredibly well. And so it was, she came back the next spring, when he ought to have been riding out, according to his holy oath, with his army. And they were betrothed, and the marriage was said for the Beltane after. And so it was, they were married with great joy, and all his castle was decked out as this can be decked out, in beauty and in splendour. But just on the eve of the wedding, which was on Beltane, rumour came that riding out from the rocks on the moor was a great host of broad, small people with long beards. And Helm laughed, for he had almost forgotten Anarion. And he said, It is my blood brother! Open the city gates! And in came Anarion, with such a feast and such a folk, beautiful beyond beautiful they made the castle, beyond the belief of man, with the toys and joys of dwarfs. For a month they feasted. And at the end of the month the dwarfs left, and Anarion said, leaving last, Do not forget your words to me. But how will I hear? Oh, you will hear, by wind and by rain. And Helm and his new wife settled down, and they ruled for 2 years or more, until, at the beginning of one autumn, that Helm heard, somewhere in the wind and the rain, that his friend Anarion was to be married that Hallows Eve. And so it was, he got out his greatest men, his finest warriors, his best treasure, to honour the dwarves as they had honoured him, and rode off at the end of October, into the rock and into the wind. Coming then upon the wild moor, he saw a great rock door was opened, and there was Anarion and all his dwarven hosts waiting for them. Well, Anarion and the dwarves welcomed them in, and they banqueted and feasted for a month or more. And then at the end of it, Helm turned to Anarion and said, It's time for me to go. I must go back to my own lands and my own wife. And Anarion looked at him funnily and said, Must you go? Must you go? Of course I must. Even though the lands have changed. What do you mean changed? It's only been a month. How could they change that much? And Anarion looked at him and said, Are you sure it has only been a month? Well, maybe a little more. And Anarion said, I would have you stay here with me, to be my blood brother, with me. I must go home. All right, if you must go home, take this last gift. And he gave then Helm a great white bloodhound, as big as a horse. And then the dwarf said, If you want my advice, as the lands have changed, do not get off your horse until you hear this hound bay 3 times. What nonsense, said Helm. And off he rode. When he came back to his palace, but it was gone. Low mounds was all that seemed to be left of his once great castle. What storm has taken it? And then he rode to his nearest city, his capital city. And although the Roman walls seemed to be marked out full square, the city was gone. Low mounds, nothing. And he rode on, and everywhere he had known lay in ruins. And new towns seemed to have sprung up where he did not remember them. He came at last to a small hovel, and there was a woman came out and said, "Who are you? Who are you riding in this storm like this?" Speaking in a voice quick that he found difficult to understand. And Helm said, "I am your King Helm." And she scratched her head and said, "Our king is Alfred, but he's off fighting the Danes. I don't know about a King Helm. I tell you, these lands are, or perhaps once were, mine." And the queen and the old woman scratched her head and said, "Oh yeah, I do remember a story my father was told by his great-great-great-great-grandfather, that it came from his time. It came down the generations, that in those days there was a King Helm, and that he ruled with great splendour and had feasts that lasted a month or more, but that one day he rode off into the rocks and was heard never again." Just at that moment, Helm's chief advisor said, "This is nonsense. I'm going to get off and spank and hit that woman to teach her to stop her cheeking her king." And he jumped off his horse. But the moment he got off, it was as if the death of 3 or more centuries fell upon him, and he was turned to bone and to ash and blown away in the rising storm wind. And Helm and all his men rode off into the storm, into the weather, into the wild and into the wind. Men say he rides to this day around these wild lands, that you can hear him in the storms, and that he will not return, and the hound will not howl or bay 3 times, not until the very end of time, when Helm and Anarian will return to these unhappy lands, trying once to unite them for good or for ill, by bloody, ferocious war. But is it a ghost story or a fairy story? I leave you to decide.